Okay, so I'm Guy, and I'm working at a company, mobile game publisher and developer called Plarium. We're a fairly large publisher and developer. We were founded almost a decade ago. Headquarters are in Israel, but we have offices across the world, Russia, Ukraine, Europe, the US. And we have over 1,200 people working at Plarium as different studios across the world. Now, these numbers are not just to boast, but to just explain exactly what I'm doing at the company. At some point, we realized we need some kind of interface with the platform holders. So we are a mobile-first company. Our main platform holders that we work with are Google and Apple. And we realized that we need to get better at having that kind of internal knowledge base for the different studios and different teams. So that's what I do at the company. I try to drive innovation through adoption of new technology. And you can think of me as an internal evangelist of new tech. I'm basically at part of the research department. I let the R&D guys deal with the development. And my background, which might be relevant later in this talk, is from the EDA industry, company called Cadence Design System. Not sure any of you have heard of it, but it's basically going, a much different direction, closer to the hardware device manufacturers. So the first problem I had when I got into Plarium is realizing how many Android devices there are, right? Google Play lists around 15,000 devices. And as a game developer, it brings the question, which one of these devices should we target? Which one should we test on for QA purposes? And that was actually my first research project at Plarium. And back then, I didn't even realize how big that thing is. And what I also realized is that you're going to sail an ocean of Android devices. You need the right tools. Not sure if that's the best analogy because it's the Mediterranean, but that ship isn't going anywhere regardless, right? On iOS, luckily, it's like it's not a bed of roses, but on iOS, at least this aspect is easier. You have smaller device fragmentation, and in general, 2018 devices will be more powerful than 2017 devices because it's always high-end devices. What's even greater is that you get fast adoption of new OS releases. So this is from Mixpanel reports. Back when iOS 11 was released, about a week after the release, you could see that almost all iOS users were using either iOS 11 or iOS 10. You don't need to support more than 2-3 versions, backwards tops. And when you compare them to, to the mobile ecosystem, iOS devices tend to be quite powerful. So you usually won't have this kind of performance issues if you're targeting the mobile ecosystem as a whole. If you want things to complain about, you can complain about aspect ratios or the notch or stuff like that, but that's not the topic of this conversation. Life is easier on iOS, so I will mostly touch Android here. Okay? So it brings back the question, how do we measure the Android ecosystem? How do we measure what we should be targeting? You can use internal data. That's only if you collect that kind of data in the first place. And even if you do, that's skewed towards your current player base. So let's say we're making a strategy game. Next month, we want to make a casual game. It's not the same user base, so our own data might be a little bit skewed, right? Instead, you can try to go for publicly available data. The bad news is that some sources that used to publish this kind of information are dead now. OpenSignals used to share reports. Unity Analytics had publicly available hardware stats. You can still work with Unity Analytics now, but you need to partner with them and implement analytics in your game if you want to get access to that kind of information. Luckily, Google also gives you some Android distribution dashboards. I'll go over some of this stuff, but first I want to show you the problem that you will still have, right? So even if you find the top 10 devices in the market right now, they still represent only 15% of the market. So these numbers are going way back, but every year you can test it again and you will see that the top devices are just a very small share of the market. So you need to take a different approach unless you want your QA guys to test the game on hundreds of different devices. And that's basically what I did. I'm not sure if you can see all of these devices, but they have a few things in common, right? So you get your Samsungs and your LGs, HTCs, Motorola's, but all of them are running the exact same screen resolution, 1440p. All of them have 4 gigabytes of RAM, and all of them are running the exact same Qualcomm Snapdragon chipset with the exact same GPU, which is Adreno 530, okay? So Samsung is special. Some of their Galaxy devices are running on their own Exynos SoC. Others are running on Qualcomm, but except for that, all of these devices are basically the same when you look at the engine and not, on the exterior. And all of them are, or at least used to run Android 6 Marshmallow when they were released. And that's good news for us, because what you can do is take the system on a chip approach, SoC approach as I call it, and then you realize that Android devices are 98% based on ARM architecture. The rest are Intel, but it's just insignificant numbers. And there's only a handful of hardware manufacturers that actually work with ARM to implement that architecture in their chipsets, right? So you have Qualcomm, Samsung, MediaTek, Huawei, NVIDIA, Imagination, and maybe a few insignificant others. That's still better than working on 15,000 distinct Android devices. Even if you factor that 2 devices will have different screen size, RAM size, or OS version, that's still better. It's better for you to look at it from this approach. And I'll demonstrate. Okay, so GPU is basically the thing that will be blocking your graphical performance in your game. And again, I went to Unity Analytics. This is from way back, but what I found back then was that despite having so many different Android devices, 10 different GPU models represent 80% of the entire Android market, okay, entire ecosystem in terms of units, okay? It changes over time, but the 10 devices to 80% ratio still remains almost the same, okay? This means that if you're picking up 10 distinct phones, that each of them has a very specific GPU from this list, you can cover 80% of the market for QA. That also begs the question, wait, which device of these 10 should I target? So what you want to go for is usually the lowest common denominator. You want to go for the weakest device, because if the game will run on the weakest device, it will most definitely run on the more powerful ones. Once again, you have benchmark websites that actually test these kind of things. Every device, they let user test their devices. They give them an arbitrary raw score. But what should matter to you is that if one device got 4,000 points and the other got 8,000 points, you target the device which got less points, and then the more powerful device will be able to run your game as well. That also applies to OS markets fragmentation. Again, I mentioned Mixpanel earlier. They show you iOS fragmentation. But for Android fragmentation, you can look at official numbers from Android's own distribution dashboard. Okay? You might want to run a sanity check. These represent the entire ecosystem and maybe not the game segment. So you got Android devices running TV set-tops and tablets and phones. So you need to ask yourself, is this actually representing my market? But it's still a good rough estimation. But it's, it's one point in time. They will show you the devices as of right now and how, how the OS version distribution is among these devices. But you're not targeting the game right now. You want to release your game next year or the year after that. And that's when you can do some data manipulation. How can you predict the future? To quote a good friend of mine, a person known as Kane, he who controls the past commands the future. And what you can do is use web archives. Anyone familiar with web archives? Okay, so Google's own dashboards have snapshots from earlier years. So you don't need to be a statistical genius to plot some of these numbers from earlier, and then you can see where each OS version is going. So even if you target 1-2 years into the future, you get a kind of ballpark of where the OS is going. So you can say that, hey, 2 years from now, I won't have to support Android 5 anymore. Android 6 will most definitely be the lowest OS version that I need to support. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, is the Google Play Console device catalog. How many people are using that right now? Okay, only a few. More of you should, if you have a game on Google Play, more of you should look into that, because it's a very powerful a resource for realizing which devices are running your game. So again, it's a little bit skewed towards your own games already available in the marketplace, but it's still a great resource because it lets you exclude games from devices that you don't want to support. So for example, let's say we found a very specific bug in a Nexus 9 device. We can cross this game out so Google Play users will not download it and realize that the game is broken. But if we go back to the SoC approach, which I mentioned, this tool also lets you filter devices based on these kind of specs: RAM, screen size, SoC. So instead of just removing Nexus 9, let's remove all the devices that are running Tegra K1 by NVIDIA, which is the SoC powering the Nexus 9 and a few other devices. So again, that's still a bit technical, but what's even better with the device catalog is what you can get from a marketing perspective, right? So you have a technical question. Your developers are coming to you, they're saying that it's really hard to support the games on devices with less than 1 gigabyte of RAM. Should I do it? And the marketing question is actually, what % of my player base is using devices with less than 1 gigabyte of RAM? Even more interesting question is, how is my game rated amongst these kind of devices? Maybe I have many players, but the game doesn't run well on these devices, so I'm getting really bad reviews. And the nicest thing is what revenue percentage is coming from these kind of devices. Now, Android gives you, the Google Play dashboards for Android, they give you all this information. These numbers are fabricated, by the way. We're not making $3 billion on Android alone, in 30 days at least, yet. And but basically, that's what you can get for each segment, each way you segment your Android devices on the Google Play dashboard, right? So you can get the install and the ratio out of the total. You can get the cumulative average rating compared to the total, and the revenue spent compared to the total. So now your marketing guys can also look at this kind of technical information and give a marketing answer for the developers. And that's extremely important if you want to make the right business decisions. Okay. Again, it's awesome. If you haven't been using it already, start using it. But then again, what I also mentioned earlier, you have to remember the market changes over time. This data is slightly skewed. What's correct for your game right now might not be relevant for the next game you'll release 1 or 2 years into the future. But with that in mind, again, very useful and something you should always have as part of your toolbox. Okay, that's it, I guess.